The larger picture has always to be kept in mind. The larger picture of our civilization, our Western civilization, that has given us the freedom, the opportunity, the prosperity, understood not as a statistical measurement of economic categories. It is a measurement of the realization of human potential, of God-given talents. And that is what produces the creativity, the innovation, the new technologies that result in the enhancement of the standard of living. But what really is at the heart of this civilization? It is a recognition that there is a God-given order in the world, and that's really what the fundamental war is about. War between those who believe that there is a transcendent, objective, universal moral order, and those who don't believe in this, and who would be God themselves.
Some people thought communism would be paradise. Well, that didn't work out too good. But you know, they survived for decades before most of the people realized the evil intent that they had.
At the beginning of the 20th century, planning a Marxist revolution may seem totally unrealistic, especially in Tsarist Russia, which is quickly becoming a major economic power in the world. The least likely scenario is the power takeover by Lenin's extremists, who, though calling themselves Bolshevik, i.e. a majority faction, are in fact a minor force among émigré communists. Apart from them, hardly anyone treats the widely propagated class struggle program so literally. The Soviet Union would never have existed in the first place without the First World War. The First World War completely destroyed the old world order. People lost all faith in national values, religion, church, government, because they had all facilitated the mass slaughter, the horribly senseless slaughter. And for this reason, many alternative ideas may have seemed attractive.
And it was natural for many people to believe that capitalism has failed. And so they were willing to look at possibly socialism or communism as a solution to the world economics.
Thus, Marxism, which under normal circumstances would never have attracted many followers, came to the fore because it provided an explanation for the cause of the war. Nobody else could answer the question why the war had broken out. Marxists did. Idiotic answers, certainly, but still the only ones provided. And, additionally, they would also tell you what to do about it. The communist press would declare, "The murderous war provoked by Europe's bourgeois governments, guided solely by the interests of capitalist cliques of various states and nations, triggered revolutionary forces bound to transform it into an all-out war against the world of oppression and exploitation." In Petersburg, when the Grand Duchess was woken up by street noise, she sent her maid out to check what was going on. The maid returned and said, "My lady, there's a revolution out there." "Very well, but what do the revolutionaries want?" "They want a world without the rich." This ideology can be viewed as a large-scale attempt at social disintegration. Take the class struggle slogan. It is natural for human community to evolve into a class society, i.e., a society whose internal divisions are based on the different functions performed by various social groups. However, there has always been some unifying principle. Different classes would offer each other different services. Marxists replaced these social ties with the notion of class struggle. As events at the front began to deteriorate for the Russians, the only solution seemed to be to depose the Tsar, who showed little interest in ruling the country, a monumental error on his part, but that's the type of person he was. Urged repeatedly to give up the throne, he finally agreed to abdicate in February. He had been pressured by the Russian generals, the military, politicians from the Duma, including Kerensky, Lvov, and circles linked to Social Democrats, all people who took Russia's interest to heart. A Russian emigre historian named Katkov, a distant descendant of the critic Katkov from Pushkin's times, wrote a book entitled The February Revolution, published incidentally by Alexander Solzhenitsyn's foundation, in which he talks about the Masonic foundations of the revolution. In truth, the provisional government that deposed the Tsar consisted of Freemasons. This Masonic government did not materialize overnight. The history of Russian Freemasonry is quite rich, especially since the days of Alexander I. The influence of the Freemasons had waxed and waned over the centuries until finally they created their first fully-fledged government. Following the Tsar's abdication and the takeover by the new government, Russia remained a loyal ally of Britain and France in the war against Germany. During the February Revolution, the Communists, Lenin's Bolsheviks, played a minor role, Lenin remaining in Switzerland. Revolutions and social upheavals cost money. They're what are called money-intensive. People need to travel around the country, gather supporters, set up a publishing house. The Bolsheviks, sworn enemies of monarchy and private property, got help at a crucial moment from the least expected quarters. Order number 7443 of the government of the German Reich to the Stockholm branch of Deutsche Reichsbank, dated March 2nd, 1917. We hereby inform you that you are going to receive questions from Finland concerning money transfers for pacifist propaganda in Russia. Applications will be sent to you by some of the following persons: Lenin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Trotsky, Sumenson, Kozłowski, Kolontai, Sivers, or Merkalin, following our instruction number 2754, Swedish, Norwegian, and Swiss branches of private banks have opened accounts for these persons. Needless to say, the aim of the Kaiser's general staff was not a worldwide revolution. Their aim was to weaken Russia. But the Germans did not foresee the long-term consequences of their policies. Yet they provided Lenin with resources. This was crucial because at that point only the communists had abundant resources at their disposal. So they could start printing newspapers and brochures right away, setting everything up. It is all feasible once you have the money, so that was a catalyst of sorts. At the turn of March and April in 1917, German authorities provided Lenin's group with transport from Switzerland to Russia's capital Petrograd, in a sealed carriage that was granted diplomatic status. The tickets had been provided in person by Trotsky's acquaintance Alexander Parvus, also known as Israel Lazarevich Helfand, who acted as a communications liaison between Lenin's group, German general staff, and international financial institutions. As Winston Churchill put it years later, Lenin was transported into Russia like a plague bacillus. Report to General Staff in Berlin, dated April 21, 1917. Lenin's arrival in Russia successful. Acts strictly as intended. Meanwhile, in New York, Trotsky, who had been swiftly granted US citizenship, met with representatives of local banking houses, which were to continue financing the revolution. Undoubtedly, the fact that the West, or some part of it, gave Lenin and Trotsky a helping hand was important, of course. The Germans had their own reasons. They wanted to eliminate Russia as a player in the war. Why the Americans gave money to Trotsky is a mystery. It is really a riddle. There is no logical explanation why they would do this.
Most people are not aware that the Bolsheviks, most of them were Jews in the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution, and they had a natural network worldwide with other Jews around the world, including in the United States.
In America's liberal circles, Tsarist Russia was perceived as a reactionary force, blocking left-wing tendencies, standing in the way of progress. In fact, they had always been against Russia.
As a matter of fact, many of the early Jews, both in the U.S. and Russia, believed that maybe the Soviet Union and communism was the future for the Zionist movement.
Lenin fooled the Freemasons from the provisional government. He had wrapped them around his finger. Generally speaking, they thought he was their ally, and he simply overthrew them all in an instant. That's why one of the most prominent, well-known Russian Freemasons, Nekrasov, organized a failed assassination attempt on Lenin on January 1st, 1918. He was eventually shot on Stalin's orders in 1939. The beginning of November 1917. According to the Julian calendar, which was used in Russia, it was still October. The Bolsheviks orchestrated a coup d'etat in Petrograd, overthrew the provisional government and the parliament in which they had failed to win a majority. The legend of the revolution is in fact a cinematic myth. The key scene of the crowd storming the Winter Palace that Eisenstein showed in his movie is pure fiction, as no such event ever took place. The Winter Palace was entered by several Bolsheviks. The palace was totally empty with nobody defending it. Eisenstein's vision was pure propaganda, aimed at legitimizing the Soviet takeover as power of the people. After the coup, Lenin immediately fulfilled his obligations towards the Germans. Announcing the peace decree, he pulled Russia, an ally of Western powers, out of the war, winning with that move the support of the masses of conscripted soldiers. The trainloads of Deutschmarks that financed the Bolshevik movement led to the coup d'etat, the overthrow of the legal authorities, all of which was aimed at weakening Russia and eliminating the Eastern Front, so that Germany could concentrate on the war in the West. Up to a point, the plan succeeded. The Brest Peace Treaty successfully eliminated Russia as a military opponent. The famous Brest maneuver, the Bolsheviks' readiness to make huge concessions in the name of staying in power at any price. It should be remembered that the 1918 Brest Peace Treaty was a truly traumatic experience for most Russians because the Bolsheviks, determined to save their regime at all costs, were giving up vast territories in the western parts of the Russian Empire. The post-peace treaty trauma was one of the reasons behind the Civil War, or behind some of the more active Russians standing up against the Bolshevik regime. Immediately, the Russian people, I'm proud to say, told us that we were slaves. But it makes me proud that it was the Russian people that first resisted communism and fought for 4 years, and even longer in the Far East. Thus we had our terrible Civil War. Communism depends on radical change, a sudden transformation of ownership relations. Marx argued that private property was the root of all injustice, so private property had to be eliminated. It seems to me that terror is almost a secondary consideration, since terror acts as a deterrent. In the event that the owners want to protect their property, they need to be dissuaded from doing so. Viewed from that perspective, the system can be defined as a deviation from Western civilization, from Latin civilization. In Western civilization, private property is regarded as conducive to the development of both the individual and the development of society. This was the accepted view in the Christian sphere until the arrival of Marx and the Marxists, who started to question and undermine the very notion of private property.
Którzy zaczęli totalnie negować instytucję własności prywatnej. Jeden z francuskich rewolucjonistów...
A French revolutionary socialist, Proudhon, is famous for his answer to the question, what is private property, when he wrote, it is theft. Lenin must have liked the definition, for it was he who later came up with the famous slogan, steal what has been stolen. The Bolsheviks confiscated estates, houses, factories and banks. They initiated assaults, rapes and murders. Their swelling ranks are thus united by complicity in crime, even atrocities. At the same time, Lenin declared a state of war communism, which meant, among other things, a ban on strikes, which are punishable by death, and compulsory food rationing. The enormity of these crimes was so huge that they had to keep committing ever more atrocious crimes for fear of being held accountable for the previous ones. It was a vicious circle. Murderers who keep murdering to avoid being brought to justice. From Lenin's notes, the more members of the reactionary bourgeoisie and clergy that are executed by firing squad, the better. Mercilessly suppress kulaks and confiscate all their crops. Hang them without delay, so that the people can see at least 100 wealthy kulaks and rich men, blood-sucking leeches, hanging, so that for hundreds of miles around people would see and tremble with fear. What was a kulak? With 3 cows already that makes you a kulak. Take two peasants. One of them gets up at 4 a.m., keeps plowing all day, turns in late. Meanwhile, the other one plays his accordion, drinks his moonshine, has a good time, and stays poor. Those individuals who worked hard posed a threat to communism. Why? Because they had their own money. Such a person is self-reliant and independent. He does not vote. He doesn't join the crowds chanting communist slogans. He has his own house, 3 cows, a nice wife. What does he need communism for? And such individuals had to be annihilated. The armies of the White Russians, Russian counter-revolutionaries fighting against the Bolsheviks, received support. England, France, the United States and Japan sent soldiers and military advisors hoping to rebuild the Eastern Front, or at least to ensure that the wartime loan taken by Russia is repaid. However, not all of the intervening powers have the same interests. Some of them openly assist the Bolsheviks, like the Americans in the Far East, for example. One of the first legends, today it's fashionable to call them founding myths, was the legend of Western intervention. Allegedly, the West deployed improbable might, whereas in fact the interventionist forces were small, but they provided an excellent pretext for introducing mass terror, a wartime economy, war communism, and of course the horrible carnage involved in the annihilation of entire social groups, mainly the intelligentsia, the aristocracy and the farmers, both rich and poor. From Lenin's letter to Trotsky dated October 22nd, 1919. Shouldn't we mobilize some 20,000 more Petrograd workers, plus some 10,000 members of the bourgeoisie, put machine guns behind them, shoot a few hundred down and thus achieve a genuine mass assault? Anyone who was against the revolution, against communism, was executed. Everyone. Or they fled the country. The Tsar's family was liquidated. All of the nobility was liquidated. All of the blue bloods. To hell with them. All the businessmen were liquidated. Anyone who had their own business was bourgeois, so they were destroyed. They began an extensive program of de-Russification. The de-Russification of Russia. Russia's social elites were annihilated. Russian clergy, Russian culture. All the officers were executed. Some of them had joined the Red Army, but they were executed afterwards anyway. They had served their term, they had done what they were supposed to do. The intelligentsia was either annihilated or, please pardon my language, but in Russian we use in this context the phrase to bitch someone, which means to turn someone into a female dog, so they were bitched. A severe blow was dealt, aimed to make room for the new elite. Lenin declared, "The whole of society will be one office and one factory, with one equal standard of work and pay for everyone." Trotsky claims, if we are serious about a century-planned economy, then work must be assigned and managed in a military manner. The ultimate aim of communism is to create a new Soviet man. That is one who has been trained by philosophers. The philosophers had grasped the relentless laws of historical processes and were therefore entitled to the privilege of exercising political power. For if they knew the end of the historical process, it goes without saying that listening to anyone who is still ignorant of it is just a waste of time, and discussing things with them amounts to delaying foreseeing the arrival of the better, brighter future.
Lenin was very eager to punish his enemies. Actually, he and Trotsky together were the co-creators of the Gulag. And Trotsky probably was the first person to use the expression concentration camp in Russian. So it was Trotsky who conceived of this idea that they could set up camps for enemies of the people. And Lenin was very enthusiastically supported the idea. And the camps, the first camps, they were not well organized and they were not well thought through, but the first camps were set up then. They were very specifically designed for counter-revolutionaries, for people from the White Army, and really for anybody else who got in the way of the new system, the new commissars, as they came into power all over the country.
State-endorsed atheism was to be the official policy of the Soviet Union. Anti-religious legislation, confiscations, imprisonments and judicial murders would soon affect the clergy of all denominations. Following the arrest of Patriarch Tikhon, along with all the members of the Orthodox Synod, 32 metropolitans and archbishops would lose their lives. Metropolitan Veniamin of St. Petersburg was doused with cold water by Bolsheviks, who left him in the cold to freeze to death and then drowned him. Bishop Hermogenes of Tobolsk died tied to the paddle wheel of a steamboat. Bishop Andronik of Perm was buried alive. Archbishop Vasily of Chernigov was crucified and then burned. A state was created of which the central ideology had been formulated by Trotsky and his cronies. It was a red state, a messianic state, and in many respects a mystical state. Perhaps even an agnostic state that in those days developed all the symbols of the future Soviet system. These symbols are present in the red stars, in the red square, and in Soviet rituals. It was the state which intended to use Russia as the main base for military operations aimed at worldwide expansion. The Comintern was created in Moscow in March 1919. An international communist organization conceived as the high command of the world revolution. Communist propaganda in the West proved increasingly successful. Revolutions took place in Germany and Hungary. Plans to implement communism across the globe seemed real enough. Exporting the revolution was the basic and fundamental goal from the very beginning of the Bolshevik state. Germany was supposed to be the first stage. Only after combining Russia's human resources with Germany's economic potential was the revolution's ultimate victory deemed feasible. Where's the money? Where's the heavy industry? Where's the military technology? In Germany. We must bring Germany under our control over the dead body of Poland. They were already on the outskirts of Warsaw. At the beginning of August, the Political Bureau had already made a decision to start building a railway connection with Germany for the transport of crops and arms which Russia needed and which were available in Germany. For the Bolsheviks, for the Bolshevik leaders, the war with Poland was traumatic because they had been certain of victory. In 1920, the Soviets failed to overcome Germany, to join forces with the German Revolution, and to overcome all of Europe, because the Poles were still old-style Poles back then, and they resisted. Lenin at a closed council of the Soviet government on September the 20th, 1920. The Polish War was the most important turning point, not only in Soviet Russia's policy, but also in world politics. That's because we believed that somewhere near Warsaw was located not only the center of Polish bourgeois government, but the center of the entire contemporary imperialist system, and that circumstances allowed us to disturb this system and implement our political agenda, not only in Poland, but also in Germany and England. Everything was there for the taking, but Piłsudski and his Poles caused a gigantic, unprecedented defeat for the cause of worldwide revolution. We will continue to move from a defensive strategy to an offensive one, without respite, until we finish off these Poles for good. From the perspective of the system, outward expansion was necessary because the system could not exist on its own. As a kind of parasite, it can only exist at the expense of the outside world. So, if the nurturer is gone, the parasite has to start transforming itself. Meanwhile, the war communism implemented nationwide bore its first fruit: a total collapse of industrial and agricultural output. People started dying of hunger. We've destroyed the country to defeat the White Russians, Trotsky admits. In order to survive, communists needed to radically revise their policy. The system began to transform itself immediately after its inception. In 1921, Lenin already knew that they had not made it, they'd failed. They had planned a worldwide revolution which had not happened and wasn't about to. And then he introduced a very radical change, NEP. They introduced a new economic policy. There was war communism and there was nothing to eat. So they invented NEP. This was no new policy for the economy, it was just regular old-style capitalism. Do whatever you want, and we won't bother you. There's nothing new about it. It was simply business as usual. What do you want to do? You want to make bricks? Make bricks and sell them. You want to produce roof tiles? Go ahead. And you can make your pots, and you dolls, and you lighters. And you can raise your crops. Immediately, goods were available. Some basic elements of economic accounting were introduced. The land taken away from peasant farmers remained in the hands of the state, but the farmers were now allowed to cultivate it. Furthermore, things otherwise inconceivable under communism appeared, such as a stock exchange, banks, bank loans, joint ventures, or even privately owned companies. Since people didn't trust the communist currency, gold coins were introduced. There actually was a gold czerwonec. There were silver and gold coins in circulation. Western capital was brought into the country. Russo-American joint ventures producing textiles began to appear, and about 60% of foreign capital was allowed in the mining of silver or other natural resources. Westerners could arrive with the machines and technologies, all of which eventually stayed behind. With NEP, there came a thaw in relations with the West. Hostilities ceased for a while, the class struggle lost steam, and friendships with capitalists at home and abroad are forged. It was a truly radical retreat from a Marxist perspective. The principle is to maintain influence and the leading role of the party. All else is just a question of tactics. For everything else, including the economic issues, the fundamental premise was to maintain power. It would be a mistake to think that the new economic policy has put an end to terror. We still have to resort to terror in general and to economic terror in particular, instructed Lenin. Trotsky explained, terror can be very effective, especially when applied to a reactionary class that refuses to leave the stage of its own volition. Since direct military action had failed because of Poland, what remained were deception techniques and field operations such as provocation, infiltration. In 1921, Lenin wrote a memorandum to Commissar for Foreign Affairs Chicherin. It was an instruction of sorts on how to conduct foreign policy. Lenin to People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs Chicherin, to the conclusion that the cultured classes of Western Europe and America are unable to comprehend today's situation and the actual relations of power. These classes should be considered deaf and dumb and treated accordingly. A special maneuver should be carried out. Firstly, to appease the deaf mutes, we should announce a fictitious separation of our government from the Politburo and most of all from the Comintern, declaring them to be autonomous organizations independent of the Soviet Union. The deaf mutes will believe it. Secondly, let's declare our willingness to establish relations with capitalist states based on mutual non-interference in one's internal affairs. The deaf mutes will believe it. The raison d'etre of the Soviet state was the constant deception of the West and of its own citizens. Deception or disinformation in this context, denoting not just single lies, which everyday propaganda was full of, but planned, large-scale covert operations of the deception intelligence type. Some are bribed, for others it's all about their ego, for others still it's a matter of their ideological convictions, but generally the point is simply to make Western elites cooperate with the Soviets. From Lenin's 1921 memo to Chicherin. Telling the truth is a bourgeois superstition. On the contrary, the end justifies the lies. Capitalists from across the globe, chasing profits on the Soviet market, will turn a blind eye to reality, thus turning into blind, deaf mutes, who will be more than willing to give us bank loans, enabling us to support communist parties in their homelands, and providing us with necessary materials. They will rebuild our military industry, which will facilitate our victorious attacks against our providers. In other words, they'll be busy paving the way for their own suicide. In Lenin's words from 1921, we can see the genesis of Soviet strategy, their disinformation methods. Lenin died in January 1924. Meanwhile, his political testament was being meticulously implemented by the Soviet Secret Service, which deployed thousands of agents with a mission to infiltrate and deceive the West's anti-communist centers.
Now, shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the White Russians scattered around throughout the West.
The Civil War was over, and millions of Russians were emigrating to the West. Engineers, writers, poets, a whole generation of brilliant individuals fled.
And Lenin had set up the Chekist intelligence service under Dzerzhinsky. It was now called the Chekist, or the NKVD, later the KGB. It's the same thing, to track them down and wherever they are. And they did that. They traveled the world over, killing white Russians that had trying to get away. But one of the deceptions they arranged was that they created a false organization called the Trust.
Operation Trust. Operation Trust was a creation by the secret police of a false opposition inside the country, and straight away they sent information to the West that there is opposition here. Come to us. Contact begins between this false opposition within the country and the opposition beyond the borders.
They set up this organization, and then they leaked word out to all of the white Russians that were in Paris, the U.S., Scandinavia, England, and they passed the word out that the Trust was really a cover for an underground. In other words, there is anti-communist in Russia, and they've got an organization. And you want to support it, don't you? You want to come back and get in
with the trust.
The Soviet Secret Service supported all kinds of initiatives that seemed inherently anti-Soviet. It supported people who were viewed as radical anti-communists and monarchists in émigré circles. Immediately, these people have money. Publishing houses appear, they publish books, they invite Russian theatrical troops, whereas the hardcore oppositionists can hardly make ends meet. They work as taxi drivers in Paris. They have no money, nobody supports them. The whole deception, the master trick, depends on the fact that the anti-communist institutions and organizations and the anti-communist journals are headed by Soviet intelligence agents. People who do not know where to go will not approach the penniless. They'll approach those who are successful. And this is when divisions appear. One person says that no contact with the homeland is advisable, that no relations should be established, while another says that it is our homeland, that those people are trying to rebuild our country, so perhaps it might be worthwhile to get involved. Perhaps one should have a more loyal attitude to the regime. The basic idea behind the trust ruse was to make the West believe that Bolshevism was evolving, gradually losing its aggressive features, and that the Soviet Union was changing into a normal state. Any external intervention would only trigger a rebirth of militant Bolshevism, thus aggravating the position of the allegedly growing opposition within the Soviet Union. In short, the only rational option was peaceful coexistence.
It was so convincing and so real, people believed that there was an underground, and they lured several prominent Russians back into the Soviet Union.
Throughout the 1920s, the entire Russian émigré community awaited what was known as the Spring Campaign, the revival of armed struggle against Bolshevism. The Bolsheviks' aim then was to eliminate such daring individuals as Boris Savinkov by luring them back to Russia where they could be killed. Savinkov was one of those relentlessly hardcore oppositionists, so they've called him back into the Soviet Union. We're preparing an uprising, but we don't have a leader. You're our leader. Come back to Russia. He went, was arrested and killed. It was a struggle, a real struggle, continuation of the civil war with instruments that may have been less fiery but equally cruel. Operation Trust is a classic intelligence operation.
One of the most impressive deception operations the world has ever seen.
This operation from 1921 to 1927 became a blueprint, a sort of model for all subsequent Soviet operations in the future. And that's how the West was continuously fed false information on the situation in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Comintern's propaganda and the useful idiots emphasized Soviet successes and the advantages of living in the Soviet Union. There was a widespread belief that Soviet Russia had redefined its priorities and had focused on building socialism within its own borders, especially after Stalin had eliminated his main rival for power, Trotsky. The plan for a worldwide revolution seemed no longer binding. Nothing was further from the truth. They believed that only the outbreak of a large-scale world war in the West and in Central Europe would make the ultimate victory of the revolution possible. It did not matter who would win. What mattered was an economically conditioned military conflict in Europe between neighboring countries. Once the antagonists had worn each other out, they would attack, exporting the revolution. In other words, the end of NEP, replaced now by the state's self-sufficient attempts to create a military complex at the cost of starving millions of people. After the end of the new economic policy, the first 5-year plan was announced. but the Soviet economic strategy was based on a 5-year planned policy. It was a planned economy with no elements of free market whatsoever and no economic calculation. In the Soviet Union, all expertise, all efforts and all resources were channeled to fulfilling one goal, the growth of a military industry. During this period, the Soviet Union, with respect to military potential, outran practically all the countries of the world, for example, in the number of tanks produced. The concept of class struggle translated into the disintegration of traditional society. What value did it offer in its place? An answer can be found in the writings of Felix Konechny, who stated quite clearly that what you get instead is not even a fully fledged society, but a camp-style community. The language used by communists is very revealing. It is full of military terms, such as officers of industry, struggle for the plan, or ideological front. These terms are manifestations of a boot camp community. The large-scale process of the industrialization of Soviet Russia was underway, which eventually would lead to the outbreak of World War II. The Soviets needed Western technologies to create heavy military industry, as the Soviet economy was unable to modernize itself or to keep up with Western technological advances without the constant transfer of modern technologies from the West. They needed foreign currency, but their only exportable commodities were raw materials or produce, such as wood, gold, or grain. The peasant farmers were allowed to till the land. But now the Soviet Union needs more and more grain with which to buy the arms and the industrial equipment necessary to conquer the world. But the pesky farmers don't want to sell their crops. They don't want to sell for next to nothing. The farmer produces a lot of grain. But industry produces tanks, artillery, warplanes. The farmer takes his money to the market, and what does he see there? Tanks and artillery. He has no need for tanks and artillery. He needs clothes, shoes, but such articles are nowhere to be found. War communism demonstrated that if grain is taken from farmers by force, they refuse to grow it. Therefore, the only way both to force the farmers to work and to take away all the fruits of their labor is collectivization. What exactly is collectivization? It is a struggle with the Russian peasant farmer who did not want communism. They say that the communism is coming, and the farmers reply, "No way." The civil war continued. Hunger breaks all resistance. It's no problem to surround a given area with soldiers, confiscate all the food, and make sure that no more food comes in. In Ukraine, they searched farmstead after farmstead to make sure that nothing edible was left. People could eat grass and each other. Some sources report several million dead. The estimates differ. We know that in the Ukraine it was around 7 million, maybe 5. It's hard to tell because we've got different data from different regions. Peasant farmers who refused to join the collective farms were either driven out of their villages as kulaks, arrested, sent to concentration camps, or murdered on the spot. In the central Volga region, the Ukraine, and the Caucasus, the Red Army uses artillery and poison gas against rebellious peasants. In the Caucasus alone, tens of thousands of people were killed in the massacres of 1930. Stalin and the members of his Politburo personally encourage increasing the scale and the ruthlessness of the repressions. Molotov declares that resistant peasants should be drowned in rivers like cats, while their families should be split by sending the children to orphanages. To stop the flight of the starving, they are deprived of personal freedom. In 1932, the Soviet authorities reintroduced the internal passport system, abandoned in Russia in Tsarist times. To those starving individuals who reach for the unharvested crops from the fields of the collective, the penalties of the decree on the protection of socialist property are applied, which include capital punishment or a concentration camp.
The Gulag was actually the solution to several problems at once. It was a solution to the problem of what to do with millions of people who had been arrested, with dekulakization, with collectivization, and only increased after that. The Soviet regime actually needed somewhere to put people. Its prisons were overrun, and they decided to create new camps and a new camp system in the far north and the far east. So prisoners were sent very specifically to places like Vorkuta, where there was an enormous coal deposit, or Kolyma, which was a gold mine, in order to dig the resources out of the ground that no one had been able to get at before, because the conditions of life in those places were too harsh.
Stalin, when asked by Churchill how many of them he destroyed, answered 10 million. Later, the writer Chuyev, who when he met with Molotov once, asked him, how many? Molotov replied that of course Stalin had lied about those 10 million people. It was more like 20 million. 20 million peasant farmers who used to feed Russia. Listen closely to the song which the people have dedicated to their beloved father, Stalin. Life has become better, comrades. Life has become more fun, claimed Stalin in 1935 address to workers who had exceeded their quotas, Stakhanovitz. The Comintern's solemn resolution declared that the Soviet Union, having claimed the ultimate and irreversible victory of socialism, was now entering the stage of transition to communism. The symbol of the new phase will be the Comintern's gigantic headquarters, which is to be located on the former site of the dynamited biggest Orthodox church in Moscow. The Palace of the Soviets, the symbol of our homeland's greatness and power. A monstrous revolving statue of Lenin was to emit light for thousands of miles around. Rising above the curvature of the earth, it was to be visible even from Paris. In this way, Stalin created his own state, his own Stalinist society, his own Stalinist empire. It was a large-scale transformation based on bloodshed, an upheaval on an unprecedented scale. Stalin transformed Lenin and Trotsky's thoughts, finished off the systemic ideologues of that state, wiped out the old guard that had made up that state. He destroyed the elite, filling up the resultant void with a new kind of Russian ethnos, creating a rough draft nation. Comrade Stalin knew only one method: execution by firing squad. The Great Purge, beginning with the mass arrests of communists, because non-communists had already been eliminated, was a logical and necessary component of communist policy. There was no other way to change them. If he had tried replacing them, they would have replaced him instead, because they were about 1 million people with huge power. If the purge and the elimination of national communist elites had not taken place, those elites would simply have become independent. So to preserve unity, the communist and national elites had to be annihilated. That was the idea behind the Great Purge. From the diaries of Comintern chairman Georgy Dimitrov, a toast proposed by Stalin on the 20th anniversary of the revolution in November 1937. We will destroy any enemy, even if it be a great old Bolshevik. We'll destroy all his family, all his kin. Anyone who in deed or in thought mounts an attack on the unity of the socialist state will be destroyed without mercy. To the destruction of all enemies and their kin. Cheers. The system was always changing, because it never really worked, even at the beginning. War communism didn't work. They introduced NEP. NEP didn't work. They introduced collective farms. And then something had to be done again. They knew from the start that the system's founding principle was faulty, a fault called socialism, a system that didn't work. We don't want war, but we'll defend ourselves. That's why we're strengthening our defense system and will destroy the enemy on his own soil with one mighty blow. And small losses on our part. On earth, in the sky, over the seas, our song resounds, strong and stern. If it be war tomorrow, if it be marching tomorrow, you'd better get ready today. The Great Terror of the 1930s in the Soviet Union, aimed at the final consolidation of personnel before the attack on the West, affected party members, military officers and Secret Service officers. However, repressions on a previously unprecedented scale were directed against targeted national groups. The largest, known as Operation Poland, which lasted from August 1937 to November 1938, affected over 350 Poles residing in the Soviet Union, out of which, according to NKVD reports, 111,091 were shot. From the Soviet authorities' perspective, it meant eliminating hostile or unpredictable elements from the hinterland of the future front. Communism is the cancer of humanity. It must spread across the body of the world. This tumor and a live human being cannot coexist. It's one or the other. That's why the Soviet Union had to conquer the world, or it would die. Lenin said so, Trotsky said so, and so did Comrade Stalin. We cannot coexist.